Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our session today with the distinguished debut author, Rosa Kwon Easton, who is here to tell us about her book, which is a family history, I understand, but it's also infused with her imagination and her memories, and we're just thrilled and delighted and honoured to have Rosa here with us to talk to us here in person, enjoying lunch, and also to those of you who've gathered online. And we've asked Rosa really to talk us through the process of this journey of speaking to family members, of journeying to some places where she could go, like Japan, some places that she's unable to travel to, which is Pyongan province in North Korea, but to tell us this extraordinary journey of migration and of family history, and also what it takes to write a book like this. So I'm going to hand over to Rosa. Thank you very much for joining us. And we're just keen to hear about the journey through your words before we open for Q&A.
Yes, okay. I'm not sure exactly where to look, but I'll just look straight ahead, I guess. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. I'm thrilled to be back at my alma mater. I graduated from SIPA in 1990, I think. It was a long time ago. But I remember coming to these lunches and thinking, wow, those people are so smart and experts, and I feel like an imposter a little bit sitting here today, but I am a debut author. My book just released on December 1st, and it's inspired by my own grandmother, who was a young woman growing up in 1930s Japan-occupied Korea. It follows the journey of Mi-young, who is 11 and has dreams that are too big for her small poor farming village outside Pyongyang. And so when she gets the opportunity to follow her older sister to Japan, she's elated because she's able to continue her education and avoid an arranged marriage. But when she arrives in Japan, things are not as she expected, and soon discovers that she has to pass as Japanese to survive in a society that is rife with anti-Korean sentiment. It's really a story about family, but also about a woman torn between two worlds and the power of identity. And there's a love story in there too, which I had to make up a little bit. And so, yes, it's been quite a journey. It took me 10 years to write this book. I wrote it first as a family memoir. I interviewed my grandmother several times before she passed away. In 2012, she was 95, and she was living in America at the time. She had immigrated here after our family immigrated here. And what inspired me to ask her questions about her life was I found some documents, an old nursing certificate written in Japanese, but it had her Korean surname and her Korean name on the document. And it was dated Showa something or other, which translates to 1938. And then I found a midwife certificate, a similar document written in Japanese, dated 1939. So those documents really piqued my interest in what was she doing in Japan at the time. And I knew my father was born in Japan, but I didn't really know why he was born there or how he ended up there. So I went to Smith undergrad. I have some friends from Smith here. And during my junior year, I took Japanese language, and I went to Kyoto my junior year of college because there was a junior year abroad program at Yoshisha University. And I discovered that I had a lot of Korean Japanese relatives. Yes. They were the descendants of my family that left Korea to go to Japan during the occupation. And then I came here to the School of International and Public Affairs and studied history, international politics, and received a certificate from what is now the Weatherhead East Asian Institute, studied with Gerald Curtis and the old gang before Merritt. And then I think I had, the immigrant parent voice talking to me as I was going through this process, because I think I actually wanted to go into perhaps academia or NGO work or something, on the international level. But I ended up going to law school and becoming a lawyer. I went to Boston College, where I'm headed next on my book tour to speak to the Women's Law Center there. I wrote for the International Law Journal. So there were all these experiences and research that I did in my student years that really shaped and informed the novel that I wrote or published at 60. So my protagonist is Mi Young, who was born in the year of the dragon, 1916. And I find it delightful that I get to publish a book about her when I'm 60, and I'm also Year of the Dragon. And she was kind of fiery and spirited, and I identified with her in a lot of ways.
Thank you very much for that introduction to. No, that was exactly what we needed to dive into it. And I'm going to start with the first question, if that's okay.
Oh, of course.
Of course, other people, please join in. And I'm a labour historian, and I forgot to introduce myself, and that's fine because we're not here for me. But just to do the logistics of, this is a Centre for Korean Research event jointly with the Weatherhead East Asian Institute and SIPA. My name is Ruth Barraclough, and I'm the new director. And welcome everyone, and we're thrilled that this is our first event as well.
Inaugural event.
Inaugural event, and I wanted to. Because I'm a labour historian, perhaps my question is about the extraordinary ingenuity of the person who in 1937, 1938, 1939, in a country where, as you outlined, there is anti-Korean sentiment, and yet here she is gaining a qualification as a professional, as a nurse, which is a difficult job. Remains a difficult job.
Yes.
And I'm just struck by this individual who managed to pull that off.
Yes.
In this period.
Yes. Yes. I was astonished as well. And she was always a big presence in our lives because she was fiercely independent. And it's kind of spoilery here, but she becomes a single mom. And so she has to navigate not only a racist society, but a patriarchal society, and have to find a means to support herself and her son during a very turbulent time. I found her to be very courageous, and I was just so moved by how she was able to do this. And so that's how I started writing a story about her, because I was curious about her motivations and what made her this way. I had to go far back. I thought I was going to write something that started like with the climax of the book that you're going to read about. But I ended up having to peel the layers back because I couldn't really understand why she made the decisions she did without understanding who she was as a child. So that's why we start the novel in 1928, Pyongan province. And we talked about this a little bit before, because I know Professor Barraclough's research is also on about missionaries, American missionaries in the northern part of Korea at the time. And my grandmother, Mi Young, in the novel is heavily influenced by the missionaries because they presented an idea that was foreign to her, which was that girls could have an education too. Girls' education at that time stopped in primary school, and their only fate was really to get married. So she envisioned a different future for herself and her mother. And all this is backstory that I was never told directly, but I could imagine. And that's why I turned it into a novel, because I wanted to enrich the narrative and also to fill in gaps that I knew existed in her memory. So I imagine that she was influenced by these missionaries and became a woman of faith a girl of faith pretty early on, because that was hope for her. She pursued a career, which is so unusual. And one of the things that you learn about writing a novel is that the main character should have an occupation and a preoccupation. So I think she was preoccupied with being vulnerable or not wanting to be vulnerable, because she had been had a friendship with a Japanese man who discovered she was Korean and had her fired from her job. She, I'm sure, felt, her first day of school was awful, and her years in school was faced with torment. So she passed as a Japanese person because she became fluent in Japanese. She wore Japanese clothing. She really didn't have an accent. She never did. Even at a very late age, she spoke fluent Japanese and fluent Korean. And I think her involvement with the Korean church helped give her community and allowed her to be an independent career woman, if you could say that, at a time where it was very uncommon. So my editors wanted me to talk about her occupation more, and I found that interesting because, yes, it was an important part of her life, but I think as readers, we identify with the struggles of labor and what that takes, and how that reflects on the circumstances, what kind of job they have, what their background is, under what conditions. So I was very interested and read many books on nursing, listened to nurses talking about their care of patients. And so I did dig deeper into the occupation of nursing, but also what that kind of healing skill could provide for the community at the time. And I think it was enormous, because the Koreans weren't comfortable going to the hospitals. In Japanese hospitals, I don't think some of them even accepted Korean patients. So it was a difficult time, but she survived, and her resilience is inspiring, and was inspired me to write this book. Yeah.
Thank you. And
Yeah.
I have one more question, if that's all right. I was very struck by you relating the story of how you came to write this book. And what I learned from that was that your grandmother was very protective of her story.
Yes.
And in fact, kind of reluctant to share too many details with you and with us, not necessarily trusting the wider world with her own private story.
Yes.
And so I was very interested then in your journey and your fidelity to her as the main character and going back to her childhood, because she's a very, considering the kind of brutality that she experiences as a young woman in Japan, she's a very engaging character. And so I was kind of struck and curious about your kind of journey of integrity as a writer, of how do you honour someone who hasn't shared everything with you, and then just related to that, because you know, you spoke a little bit about how you extracted this story from her piece by piece over time and found these documents in yourself, went to Japan, but I'm also interested in the kind of emotional terrain of this story. And you mentioned that there's a love story in there, but you had to make it up. And when I heard that, I was wondering, like, to me, there's two, as a reader, there's two love stories. There's the love story for the extraordinary young man who's a pillar of his community, who sweeps her off her feet and so forth, but who is terminally ill. But then there's also her son, who she has to fight the kind of pre-modern family to be able to...
With the mother-in-law.
With the mother-in-law, to be able to have him for herself, in a sense. So that is such a deep love story as well. So I guess I have these questions about the emotional heart of the book, I guess. Like, first of all, your grandmother, but also the love stories within it. And I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about that.
I loved writing those love scenes. I think
they're wonderful. Yeah, they're wonderful. Yeah. Subtle as well as beautiful. And
thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, I think, you know, she was secretive, and she hid a lot of things because secrets kept her alive. And I think that's what she sort of held on to all her life, that she held those decisions that she made close to her heart because they might not have been the conventional decisions. Falling in love even wasn't conventional. It was arranged marriage. So she was given the liberty, well, not the liberty, but she had the opportunity to pursue pure love, which couldn't possibly exist if she was living in Korea in a traditional home. She did not come from a traditional home. So everything she's done in her life, and these parallels to the immigration journeys, our immigration journeys, my immigration journeys, I had so many aha moments that were amazing. And one of them was, wow, 3 generations of my family immigrated, were displaced from their home. So my grandmother left Korea to go to Japan. My father, who's Ko-chan in the novel, he leaves his birthplace, which is Japan, to return to Korea. And I am writing the sequel, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But he lives in Manchuria, and that's part of the next book. And then he immigrates to America. Well, and then I was born in Korea, and I immigrate to America. So I have this inherited, they call it inherited trauma in psychology, but I have these memories, I think, that were stirred up by writing this book, that this is really my story and many of our stories of moving from one home to another. What self do you find in the new place? What self did you sacrifice or lose in your old, especially at that age, at a tender young age? So she closed herself up to love, I think. She didn't really talk about those painful memories too much, but I know she loved her husband, but she had closed herself up and she opened herself up again. But then tragedy struck and she lived the rest of her life, I think, in the shadow of that love. And never really found it again. And then, of course, there's the love of the grandmother toward her son and her own love toward her child, which was compromised by her need to work, her ambivalence about career and motherhood, some of the same issues we face today. So, yes, it is a dual love story. And my next book talks about the relationship between mother and son. So the next book, I'm about 10 chapters in. I have a 2-book contract with my publisher. So I have to write the second book by August 1st.
You'll do it. You'll do it.
It took me 10 years to write this one. So
You have readers now. We're waiting.
I know. And it is a different process writing it a second time, writing a book a second time. And I know the sort of big plot points, but the emotional journey I'm navigating as I write. But it will be more of a dual point of view, with Myung still being the primary driver of the story. She's the adult, she has the agency, but soon this little boy is going to have agency too. So from his point of view, what is happening to him as a child, as a displaced person? He doesn't really know that yet, but he will live through the the Russian occupation in the north, and then escape to the south and go through the Korean War and Reconstruction. And I'm calling the next one Red Seal. I have a chop there, the name, the seal that in Asia you use as your signature, because the next book is about reclaiming one's identity. You lose it, and then how do you gain it back? What part of yourself do you want to be seen, and do you want to embrace? So I think that's kind of the message of this book, is to be yourself, to be your whole self, even if that's hard, because you see examples of people having done it before, and that's the power of books, is you see yourself in them. I saw myself. The reason I became a writer was I always get kind of teary-eyed when I talk about this, but when I came to America, I didn't speak any English. I was 7, and I found myself in libraries. I'm a library trustee now and love the mission and the work of libraries. And I read whole books like about Judy Blume and Beverly Cleary and all those families that I wanted to be like. And I came across Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which is about a poor Irish girl coming of age in the 1900s. And I saw myself in her, and I said, oh, wow, this is amazing. And she too was pursuing an education and wanted to make something of herself. She came from a poor family, and she had, there were neighbors, and it was just everyday life, but so meaningful. So I think I got the idea of naming my book White Mulberry because mulberry trees were very prevalent in Northern Korea at the time. They're a hardy, resilient tree. They produce beautiful things. The bark is used to make paper. Silkworms eat the leaves and transforms into silk. Mulberry tea, you could dry the leaves and make a green tea. So the hardiness and the beauty of a tree with strong roots growing in this cold climate was striking to me. And that's why I named it White Mulberry. And there are red mulberry trees. I think there's a Western, oh gosh, what is it? A Greek myth or something that talks about a red, it's like thwarted love. Somebody meets the woman, supposed to meet the woman at the mulberry tree, and then she doesn't show up, and then he kills himself. It's like because she didn't show up, and then she finds him, and then that's how the mulberry becomes red. I'm not sure. I have to look that up again. But white mulberry trees are rare, so I thought, well, this character is pretty rare, and so I decided to name my book White Mulberry. And White, obviously, she's a nurse. She becomes a nurse, and white is a symbol of humility and equality in Japan and Korea. When you see old pictures of Korea, you see everyone's in white hanbok, because it's a symbol of we are all the same. That you have the nobility and the royalty wearing colors, but you don't see the common person wearing white. And I thought she was an ordinary person, but extraordinary in so many ways.
Thank you so much for that journey into the book. I'm just going to check the Q&A session
Yes.
in case we have some questions online, and if anyone would like to interrupt with a question as well.
Well, thank you so much for being here. It's wonderful to hear you speak about the book, and special that you're also very much a Colombian, so thank you.
Yes.
I'm curious, the relationship between Japan and Korea reflected in literature is a pretty recent, I think, expression that has entered a wider population.
Yes. Yes.
I haven't finished your book, but I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. It was, of course, racism and a paternalistic society. But there were a large number of Koreans who were also leading lives in Japan, and so it was complex. And I just wonder if you could say a bit more about how you learned of that relationship through your grandmother and what you wanted to convey about it.
Well, thank you for the question. Yes, it's a complicated relationship, for sure, because that generation often doesn't want to talk. The older Korean generation often doesn't want to talk about it because at the end of the occupation, they were forced to take Japanese names, and their culture was basically erased as part of the Nisen Itai policy, the one Japan, one nation policy. So there was a lot of hostility, and still to this day, if you speak. But my family is unusual because my father was born in Japan, and he feels a kinship to Japan, and I wanted to explore more of that connection that we have together, rather than the hostility and the animosity between the two countries, because Japan and Korea share an amazing. If you look before the 1900s, there was trade, there was art being exchanged. I took an Ancestry.com test, and I'm part Japanese, part Korean. So that idea of, I studied Korea-Japan relations on a more international policy level. My senior thesis was on Japan's foreign policy toward Korea. This was, of course, the 80s, which has changed a lot. But I wanted to explore the human connections between the two. So I think that's where my interest came. I'm just very interested in human behavior, social history. And there have been a lot of books written, not a lot, but I read, as part of my research, I read stories written by ethnic Koreans living in Japan, the Zainichi, who there were fictionalized stories of their experiences, and they were so heart-wrenching. I cried because it was, must have been so difficult for them to live in that society at the time. I think things have changed, but I think there's room for more change. I recently, my husband and I went to Tokyo right after we got married. This was 1992. And of course, that was 30 years ago. But I'll relay a story that happened just last year. We weren't allowed to rent an apartment because I'm Korean. Yes. So that was 92. And just last year, one of my cousins living in Kyoto told me that she was looking for a job in the garment industry, and she had a lot of experience, and this was like the best company to work at. She applied and they denied her because she was Korean. So it's, I guess it's just awareness, I think, that, and I don't know if I should say this here, but I had an experience recently on my book tour where I was asked not to talk about that relationship, to talk about more about the themes of the book. And that really, the more I thought about it, I did it because I was obligated to talk about it, but it left me angrier and angrier because this is today, this is America. So those relationships are still very sensitive and there. And so these stories need to be told because yes, we've had pachinko, we've had Korean drama that address it, in that period of time, but there aren't that many, there's not just 2 stories or 3 stories that represent this period. So I hope this spurs interest in this period of history and just that immigration is a global experience too. And we can be more empathetic when we read about these kinds of stories.
Thank you very much for telling us that story of your own experience in
Yeah.
the 1990s and your family members' experience
Yeah.
recently. Important
Yes.
stories.
But as a culture and as a society, as individuals, they're amazing, and a single person or a few people shouldn't represent the government and what their policies are, what their stance is on what history actually was, but still it's difficult to acknowledge. I don't think there's been a formal apology for at least the comfort women issue that's been in the media recently. But that's not to say that every country has its own history. And I think we need to address it head on, or at least through story.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think Sarah has a question. Sarah Jessup.
Thank you.
Hi, Sarah.
This sounds great. I look forward to reading the book. And
yes.
I've read Pachinko, and I was just thinking of the sort of tragedy of national identity for your grandmother, and wondered if leaving Korea, where there was few opportunities for women, and then going to Japan, where she was reviled as a Korean person, if she eschewed any sort of national identity, and how she thought of her identity, and if it in fact had to include some sort of national part of it,
Yeah.
if it was separate from a national identity, which had been so tragic for her.
So the national identity that she eschewed, that is your question. How did she
I'm just wondering,
feel?
the sort of examples of a national identity kind of exclude her. In Korea, they exclude her as a working
Yes.
woman, and in Japan, they exclude her as a
Yes.
Korean person.
Yes.
So why wouldn't she just reject both and say, to hell with both of you, I'm going to China?
Well,
I'm interested in her path and her own sense of self.
I think at that point she was a mother, and the war was on the horizon, and she had a son, and she saw young men, even 14-year-olds, young men going off to war. And I think that she was scared that her son was going to fight for a country that was not his birth country or his homeland. And her husband was a resistance leader. He was a nationalist in the sense of he wanted Korea to be liberated from Japan. So I think that way of thought, it was part of her character arc of how she started embracing more of her Korean national identity. And also I touch on this, that she was a woman of faith. And I think the spiritual grounding she got was home for her. So the national identity, while important, I think she had a spiritual core that sustained her. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think she learned to embrace more of her Korean national identity because she realized that's a big part of who she was, and she didn't want to deny it anymore. Kind of like maybe some of our journeys. I mean, it's been my journey. I've been embracing this because I think when growing up, I didn't know whether I was Korean, whether I was American, and I rejected the Korean side for a long time. But through the process of immersing myself in this book, I think I've learned to embrace that side of myself, and that we could be intersectional and diverse and embrace multiple identities instead of just one. Thank you.
We have a question over here. Yeah.
Yes.
I think you can be beside me. Thank you. Hello.
Hello.
My name is Darka, and I actually have several questions. First of all, if you would be kind enough and educate me
Yes.
we talked a little bit about Japan and Korea and like
Yes.
in this misunderstanding.
Yes.
And for me, it's very like wild because usually I would expect this discrimination towards North Koreans.
Oh, yes.
So can you explain me about like this differentiation in terms of like when you say Korean, like what do you mean by that, like in that conversation? And like if
Yes.
this discrimination that you mentioned in your story just now in
Yes.
1992 and so on, if
Yes.
it like, separates.
Yes.
Secondly, I also want to know more about like the production process
Oh,
of all
yes.
of that. Like, we're always going to write a book. Was it always about this? And like, how was all of this
Okay.
happening?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So when the story takes place, Korea was one country. It was not divided. There was no North and no South. So it was after World War II that, and then after the Korean conflict, Korean War, that the country was officially separated as North and South. So I think when Japan refers to Korea or the discrimination that I experienced in Japan against Koreans is really targeted more toward South Korea, because the North Koreans, I'm again, I have to research this a little bit, but I don't think there's no diplomatic relations between the current North Korean regime and Japan, but the trade and diplomatic relations exist between South Korea and Japan. So when they refer to Koreans in Japan, I think they're mostly referring to South Koreans, although there is a large North Korean community within Japan that pledges allegiance to North Korea. There's that faction, but I think when we talk about Koreans in Japan, we're largely talking about the South Korean population. I don't know if that answers the first part of your question. Yeah, yes.
I didn't know that. It's new
Yeah.
information. Yeah, that's
Yes.
really
No, I'm so glad that you're asking these questions, because again, it's not widely known. And we know so much about what happened in World War II in Europe, but we don't really know what happened to the people during World War II and after in Asia. So it's important that we know those things. And production process, like the publishing process? Yes, yes. So as I mentioned, I've been writing this book for 10 years, but originally I wrote it as a family memoir. So I wrote it as nonfiction, really sort of capture like more of a biography of my family and what happened and who the characters were, the family members. But the more I wrote the nonfiction family story, the more I yearned for the richness of the story that I felt like was lost in a biography, which is more factual. So I took a leap of faith, really, and pivoted to fiction. I wanted to fill in the gaps. I wanted to make a love story. I wanted to understand my grandmother through the process of writing the book. That might have been like the wrong way to approach it, perhaps, because you could just imagine without spending 10 years and 300 pages writing this. But it was a discovery of her, and through that, a discovery of myself. So it was well worth the journey. When I pivoted to fiction, I found that I had to go back, like I said, to understand her motivations, who she was, what forces shaped her early life. And I enjoyed trying to find the conflict that was there at the beginning of the story, crafting the story to make it compelling for readers so that they would be excited about reading the book and not bored about reading this era of history, but wanting to learn more about what happened. So for me, and I always loved historical fiction growing up, so it was something that was close to my heart to challenge myself to see if I could write something like this. And I was fortunate to find an agent. When you want to publish a book, you usually find a literary agent who's interested in your story, and they think that there's an audience for the story, there's a publisher who wants to buy it. And fortunately, because of the export of Korean culture and some recent literary books, Han Kang winning the Nobel Prize for Literature, South Korean national, there's been a resurgence or a blossoming of interest. So I'm fortunate to ride that sort of crest. But I hope the story stands for itself and that it will outlast, it will be shared by future generations. So that's, I don't know if you have any follow-up question to that, because and as I said, when the publishing company bought this book, they also bought my second book, not yet written.
I want to follow up to one of your questions, if that's all right, just to dive in to make what I think is a really highlighting a really striking thing about your book, Rosa, and that is that it gives us a history of the North before the creation of 1945, before the creation of North Korea in 1945, which I think is related to your question. And I think there is this sense that North Korea is a country without a history.
Yes.
And that it begins in 1945, and that's its origin point. And all we need to know about it is what happened after 1945.
Yes.
But your book takes us into the North before the creation of North Korea and this extraordinary features of the northern region, which is, I think, what historians call it, to kind of distinguish between the nation state North Korea that was nobody wanted, that was created by US and Soviet victory in World War II and distributing conquered territories, etc. But what your book, I think, does, which is very special, is that it takes us into the northern region before the creation of North Korea and tells us about extraordinary features of the North, like Christianity and the importance of education and the way that people in the North embraced modernity in the early 20th century, partly because they had been marginalized during the earlier Choson dynasty. So they were kind of outsiders in the Choson dynasty that was very southern-centric. And then when these new ideas of Christianity and capitalism and communism started to come, and modernity, they were embraced by the North. So your book, by opening with this girl who is curious and hungry for knowledge and finds entry point into this girls' school that's run by these Protestant missionaries, I think it's a story about the world, the North, that the world does not know.
Oh,
And
wow.
I really, so that part of her story, you know, some of the best schools in Korea were in the North.
Yes.
And some of them were girls' schools.
Yes, there was a middle school for girls. Yes.
And in Pyongyang and in Hamhung and Wonsan, different parts of North, and that history's been lost, except in memory, I think, and in people who left, and that part of the North has disappeared as well.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
as things have
because
disappeared.
people, I mean, they're all old and have passed away. And so that legacy is lost. And I think that's why thank you for explaining this sort of historical context of North Korea too, because it is an unusual aspect of the book. And that's why my agent actually picked it up, because she said that we don't know anything about North Korea before it became North Korea, or the northern part of Korea. And when I was writing it, I didn't really think about that part. But as I researched Pyongyang and researched the missionary activity there, and I found out that the village that my grandmother was originally from, Menjungri, is actually a train depot now up there. Because somebody asked me, are you going to ever visit these places? And I said, I can't. I won't be able to see it. And it's a train station now. But I am curious about seeing Manchuria someday, and China, because Manchuria was such a frontier during that time. That's another unknown sort of area, a setting for a story, because there were many Japanese in the 30s who went to Manchuria as pioneers, as the new frontier, like cowboys. And there were Koreans who lost their jobs and didn't have means, or they were sent or hired by the Japanese National Railway to build the Manchurian railway line. So it was a new frontier, and there aren't that many stories about that part of the world as well. So I'm glad I went backwards in time more than what we commonly understand in as a World War II or post-World War II world. Thank you.
Precious history. Really.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
To go back to the personal
Yeah.
research.
Uh-oh.
So I'm curious, often as children, we don't see our parents as the full people with their full history. And in doing your research, I'm wondering where your father fits into this.
Yeah.
Which I imagine is, you're thinking about for your next book.
Yes.
And has it given him insight into sort of who his mother was? That she had a more complicated, bigger life.
Yes. My father was an integral part of my research, because he sat in the interviews with my grandmother, and first of all, he helped me translate some of the conversation, because my Korean is limited, because I came when I was 7. I studied it, but there are a lot of words I don't know. And he filled in the context, and like I said earlier, he was very enamored of Japan. He was he wanted he wanted me to talk about the good things. Interestingly, when he read my book, and maybe it was because I started it as a memoir, he highlighted and underlined everything that was wrong Like, oh, that was the older brother, not the younger brother. That didn't happen that year. It happened this year. But I, as a writer, took the liberty to compress time or expand time, and moved characters' ages around a little bit to serve the story. I don't feel like it diminished the story in any way. I think it just propelled the story forward, which is what you need to do because you need to keep the reader reading. But I don't think I compromised the story, but he was concerned with the facts. And the second time he read it for pleasure. And he thought he understood his mother, but I think he understands her better now. The most unexpected thing that happened through this process is my mother, who had a fragile, fraught relationship with her mother-in-law, Myung. She said, wow, that's why she is the way she is. And she had a newfound understanding. So I think it's sort of a gift of bridging my mother's relationship with her mother-in-law, even though her mother-in-law is no longer here. It was a eye-opening experience for her. She listened to it on Audible. I have a great voice narrator. If you guys like listening, I recommend it highly. She was one of 3 people who voice narrators who auditioned to read my book, and I got to choose, along with my agent and editor, who it was going to be. And my mom listened to it on 70% speed because her English is not great. And she said, I understand now. I was like, oh, that's wonderful. And my brother read it, and he called me one day out of the blue, and he was just like, oh. And I said, what's wrong? And he said, I just finished your book. Goodbye. That was it. That was it. So I think we have I mean, me too. I mean, we have a different appreciation for the people who lived during this time in that area of the world that we know little about, and our own family and ourselves. So I suggest writing a novel highly. Even though it's hard work.
I bet it is. I bet it is. Do we have any final questions from the floor?
From the floor.
Yes.
Yes.
Because you wrote, as a lawyer, you didn't write this kind of work. And so to start and say, I'm going to write a book and it's going to be a novel, I understand, I can see how it would help to write it as a memoir and then turn it into something else. But still, you have to learn turn of phrase and, elegance of communication, bring people to life. Tell us how you did that.
Yes, it's interesting because when I first started thinking about writing fiction, my writer friends would say, oh, you should get an MFA, a Master in Fine Arts, because that's, and I said, but I already have 3 degrees. I shouldn't need this degree, but it is hard. It's a whole new craft. So I took writing classes. I worked with a writing coach for about a year, very helpful. And I joined a writing community. I had other friends that we exchanged work. It's always helpful to read somebody else's work to see what works and what doesn't work in your own writing. So I attended workshops, did residencies, fellowships, all those things that, and received tons of rejections. So it's a gradual process. And it's not for everyone because it takes a lot of sitting down in your chair for 10,000 hours. But when you make it a habit and when it's something that you find yourself you enjoy doing. It's not tedious. You feel good that you've put words on a page, and you learn the elements of story and why you enjoy story, and you start becoming a better reader. You understand human motivations better, that conflict that's in all of our lives, that what drives human relationships, the change, what is the change that occurs in a character after these series of events happen, and does the character double down and be exactly who they were at the start of the book, or is there a slight shift? And that's the essence of story, is how the character changes or doesn't change. And in some countries, the literary tradition is different. Like in Korea, I understand, I haven't read too many novels in translation, but there's not a lot of action. So I think the American literary tradition is a little different than other countries, but I was trying to learn the US version. But it's, I can't pinpoint one thing that worked over another, but I think it's our natural curiosity to learn something new, and my lifelong journey as a student that I see myself, that propelled me to write this book. So a lot of people want to write a novel. It's just finishing it. And I've met a lot of lawyers too, who have recovering lawyers who want to be writers. I think it's our love of language. But you're right, writing it as a memoir helped a lot. I was able to have an outline. I do outlining. Some writers don't outline. I'm a plotter, and they're pantsers. They fly by the seat of their pants. So they do a draft of a novel, just writing it out, and then they revise it later. I'm more of taking each chapter by chapter, making sure there's character development, there's plot movement, and the stakes are raised. So those are just sort of like the three things that I think is always going on in my mind that I learned over the 10 years of writing this book. I find now that I've finished that it is a little easier to write the second one, because I have a little editor in my head now. I know when I feel that this is slowing down the story too much. The research, which is great, but then is it summary? Do we need all of this background information? Why does the character need this information to make the next step, to do the next thing? So just essential background information, which is hard when you're writing historical fiction. There's so much happening, but what is essential to move the character forward in the story? There's got to be an engine that moves everything forward. So I just learned all these through the process of writing and getting feedback through my developmental editor, through the publishing company. And I had a cultural sensitivity reader, I had a proofreader, I had a line editor, copy editor, Japanese language reader, Korean language reader. So this book was well vetted. I did find a typo though. I was very upset. In fact, my lawyer friend found a typo. So I have to tell my editors that we have to add an N to taken.
That is so interesting to unpack the process for us. And what I hear in that is a kind of professionalism, modesty, humility that allows you to open yourself up to
Criticism.
Yes.
It's hard.
So you're a serious writer, but also in the sense of how hard that is to do when your profession is something else.
Yes.
And you are senior in that profession, and that here you are having to kind of begin again and train yourself again. But it's also must be hard because in a sense you're the keeper of the story as well, so you know a lot, and yet you still have to accept constructive criticism and all of these things.
Yes.
But I guess the final thing that I take away from that is your drive to tell this story,
Yes.
which must be powerful. And I guess you're telling us it has to be powerful to
Yes.
make it through.
Yes.
But that's what importance, if you have an important story, or two or three, or then this is what it takes. And
Yes.
it's really, really important and interesting to learn that.
Yes, yes. I think I'm obsessed. I think you have to be obsessed with this to keep going. But if you have an interest, see where it takes you, because you never know unless you try, and you don't really know what you're capable of unless you put yourself out there. So I think with more age and more experience, you allow yourself to explore more. I think if I don't know if I could have done this as a 20-year-old or a 30-year-old. I think I needed the life experience to be a mother and to experience the ups and downs in my own career and learn more about the world, have time to listen to my family's story, to process it. So all the efforts from the past really come together in the present. So nothing is lost.
Maybe we should end there on that beautiful note. Thank you very much, Rosa Kwon Easton, for coming to us and talking to us about your book, yourself, the process of writing, your family. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ruth. I really appreciate this opportunity.